Okay, so we were talking with Mike, and Mike, could you tell us sort of, where you came from, how you got into the agency, and how that went for you?
All right. Well, I come from a family that has deep roots in Montana, going back several generations. I'm from Kalispell, Montana originally. I went to University of Montana here and got a bachelor's and master's degree in geology. And over the years, I worked for U.S. Geological Survey and various mining companies and even an oil company at one point. But I wound up with the Forest Service in 1978. I started with them and I've worked for them. I worked for them for about 28 years, I believe, in total. A good part of that time was in regional office here in Missoula, where I was the regional mining geologist dealing with all mining projects in Idaho, Montana, and North and South Dakota, portions of that. I also spent a couple years in Washington, D.C. as the Assistant Director of Minerals and Geology. And then after I retired, I came back to Montana and I contracted with the Forest Service for 17 years on the same thing I was doing before, working on mining projects, the environmental aspects, as well as the intricacies of the mining law. And one of the biggest projects, biggest from complexity as well as from political significance that I worked on, was the one we're going to be talking about today, the Crown Butte mine in the New World Mining District north of Yellowstone National Park and on the Gallatin and Custer National Forests.
All right, John. So next up,
Okay.
John Drake. Could you tell us, where you're from, how you got into the outfit, and where that took you?
Sure. At any rate, I was raised on a ranch in southwestern New Mexico, and so I always kind of connected with the Forest Service. And I went to Northern Arizona University, started in northern New Mexico, and then I was promoted to ranger on the Conchilon Ranger District, which during the times when the Ray Arena thing was going on, so it was a very controversial district that I was on for a long time, 4 years. I ended up, the Forest Service sent me back to Michigan State where I got my master's. I then came back to the Santa Fe. I've been to Mississippi as the deputy supervisor. I've been in the legislative affairs staff in Washington. I was there for about 4 years. And then I was transferred out to the Gallatin as supervisor. And that's where I worked with Sherm Solid early on. That would have been in 1980. And in 84, I was transferred into the regional office where I was the director of recreation wilderness lands. And later in that whole period, about the time that this thing kind of blew up in 96, I was asked to be the director of minerals. So I actually became the director of minerals as well as the other areas. And so that's how I kind of got involved in this particular project early on.
Great. Dick, could you tell us, how you got in the outfit and how you got to this particular project?
I'm Richard Bacon. I retired from the Deputy Regional Forester position in here in Missoula, and I'm from a four-generation Forest Service family. My dad worked for him, and I worked for him. My son is currently a forest supervisor over on the Medicine Bow and Route, and my grandson took his first job with the Forest Service this summer as a summer seasonal. And I've lived in 13 different states. I knew I wanted to be a ranger when I was about 6 years old, so that was never a question. Like I say, we lived in 13 states, and I had many jobs in the Forest Service. Worked in 4 different regions in the Washington office. As Deputy Regional Forester before that, I was the fire director in this region, Region 9, and also in Region 1 here, and then in Region 9. And then in the Washington office, most of my stuff was in co-op fire. And then I was a timber beast early in my career. I started out my first summer seasonal job on trail crew when I was 18. And that's kind of how I got here.
And Dick, how did you get to be involved in the Crown Butte mine?
It'll be part of the story that I'll tell tonight, but when things kind of became very, very political and our regional forester got in trouble, I took over the visible lead.
Great. All right, Sherm. So could you tell us, where you grew up, how you got into the Forest Service, and where that took you?
Okay, well, my name's Sherm Solid. I grew up in Kalispell, Montana, went to school, Montana State University, got a Bachelor of Science and a Master's in Geology. And I went to work for the Bureau of Land Management for about 3 years as a geologist, and then with the Soil Conservation Service for 3 years as an engineering geologist. Then I transferred to the Forest Service and worked there for about 27 years as a geologist. I was a geologist and also the staff director for a group, Soil, Air, Water, and Minerals. And I became involved in this project as a geologist, as a ID team leader for a team of interdisciplinary scientists that were supposed to put together the environmental impact statement. I worked on the project at Cook City for about 8 years, and finally, as it got controversial and political, we were involved in all kinds of negotiations. But anyway, I ended up 8 years on the project.
Wow. Okay. Okay, so John, you wanted to add
Right,
something
right.
to all
Well,
that?
Dick was mentioning when it got political and he had to get involved. I just happened to think that was when I became the director, just shortly before that, at any rate. So I probably got them involved in that deal after we learned, and we got a risk assessment, and it was really a great report, we thought, but it set off the world in terms of the political reaction that we had toward this. And so I've been really interested for quite some time that we record and get this history, because the folks that were involved are here, and otherwise no one would know exactly what happened. So I think that's a very meaningful project, and the Forest Service did a fantastic job with it. So.
All right, Mike. So we're rolling, and you were gonna take us from the beginning, so to speak, with the prehistory of this spot and everything. So if you could just tell us a bit more about this site.
Sure. What I'd like to do is give a full background of this, which means starting back in geologic time a little bit and then coming forward to what brought us to the project. Just to give you the setting, there's a big red mountain at the center of this. That's Henderson Mountain. You can see how red it is from this photo. That mountain is located right here in the New World Project area here on the map, which is just northeast of Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is in purple. National Forest is all the green around it, and the dark green is wilderness area. So there's a little island there, if you zoom in, that is the New World Mining District, and that's where this project area is. This map here is a more detailed map. It actually shows, here's Yellowstone Park again in purple, but it shows the mining claims, which were all staked under the 1872 mining law. Many of them go back to when President Grant was in charge, the 1870s. So they long predate the park as well as the wilderness and the national forest. Actually, this was a mining district before there was a national forest here in the area. Geologically, this area is underlain by an ancient volcano. The volcano is long eroded, but there's still parts of it left. And when it was in place, it formed some very rich ore deposits, which the miners immediately found, because when you prospect, you look for red spots like this. It's from the minerals that are there, especially iron pyrite, that oxidize and form rust. It's basically a big red mountain because of all the rust. And 15,000 years ago, during the Pleistocene era, when this area had glaciers everywhere, when they melted back over and then were gone by about 10,000 years ago, the mountain was bleeding rust in all these drainages, and it precipitated when it got neutralized. So in Fisher Creek, which is here, the U.S. Geological Survey scientists went in and mapped it, examined it. They found rust deposits over 20 feet thick, which shows just the extent of which this mountain, after the glaciers left, was bleeding all this rust and metals and so on. And they were able to age date it from wood that was found in the Ferrocrete. So that's the setting. And when the miners came in, after Lewis and Clark were through the area and it was all explored and everything, they immediately went to this area and started digging. And at various times, there were, I think, up to 3 smelters, as well as a lot of mining going on. By the way, it's headwaters of 3 streams that flow out of here. There are about 4,000 acres of private land, and 90% of the ore in this area was privately owned. So this is a summary of the history. 1868 was when gold, silver, lead, and zinc were discovered. Some of the claims go back to 1870, which, as I said, was before Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872. The first smelter in the New World Mine District was in 1875. It was for lead ore. The Nez Perce actually raided the smelter to get the lead on their way through trying to get to Canada. Cook City in 1880 was a booming mining town, and roads were built in and around the area. In 1883, there was a second smelter built. In 1885, they put in a roasting furnace. They found gold in Henderson Mountain in 1888, put in various mills to grind it. They had cyanide in the circuit for a while to dissolve the gold to get it out. And then they found other deposits nearby at Goose Lake, which is northeast of Cook City. Third smelter in 1905. There was actually a power plant put in there. A fourth smelter on Fisher Creek was put in. They put in an aerial tramway in 1923 from the gold, dust, and homestake mines to the smelter. 13 mines operating from 1925 to 1950. The McLaren mine, which was on this mountain, was an open pit that mined 500,000 tons. And it was milled right near Cook City, and then the tailings from that milling operation, the waste, was put in Soda Butte Creek, just 1 to 2 miles from Yellowstone National Park. So this was a big acid-generating, fine-grained waste product that was in the creek, not in a well-engineered facility, and it's been bleeding into Yellowstone National Park since 1950. So, in summary, all of that shows this was an industrialized area. There was a lot of stuff that happened here from when the glaciers left on. And from 1960 to 1980, because of the fact that many mining companies thought that it still had a lot of potential because of the geologic setting, there was a lot of exploration of the district. But in 1978, there were wilderness studies looking to see on national forest as well as Park Service lands where wilderness areas might be declared. And it was a period of great environmental concern in the 70s, late 60s and early 70s. The wilderness studies evaluated the whole area, and they specifically excluded the New World Mining District because of its tremendous mineral potential. And the Gallatin and Custer National Forest, this became a part of, the area was allocated to mining. In 1987, Crown Butte started exploration, and they made discoveries of gold reserves at the McLaren mine, the old pit area here, which looked like the old miners had not fully developed it all. In 1989, Crown Butte Mines submitted a plan of operations, POO, to the Forest Service and to Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Montana DEQ is a state agency who has similar responsibilities for mining to the Forest Service, and with which the Forest Service has a memorandum of understanding and has a a deep and long-standing working relationship, which has been very successful and close working. We do joint training and still to this day. In 1990 to 91, Crown Butte Mines Incorporated discovered additional reserves besides the McLaren. They found very high-grade underground gold reserves. There were some intercepts that were 23 ounces of gold per ton. And they found 2 deposits in the Miller Creek and Homestake areas. In 91, they amended their plan of operation to just do an underground mining operation. Their proposal was for a 1,200 ton per day operation, which is actually a small mine. If you look at average mines in the US and elsewhere, they'd be 10 to 100 times that, but 1,200 ton per day is what they proposed. Part of it is because it was so high grade. They had at that time 6 million tons of proven gold, silver, copper ore, and 11 million tons possible. Part of their proposal was for a tailings facility to use a design that was called subaqueous deposition, which means putting it in a water retaining structure so that the tailings were submerged. The idea is if you submerge them, that they will not acidify. They can't get oxygen. That was the idea, and we pursued that further in our analysis. In 91 to 93, the Forest Service, the Gallatin National Forest, with Sherman as the ID team leader, and Montana Department of Environmental Quality were the lead agencies, and they did 6 rounds of reviewing the plan of operations for completeness, which meant they would say, it's inadequate here, give us more information. The company would have to go out and do more studies and provide that. In 1993, the EIS process began, and the Forest Service assumed that it would follow processes that it was very familiar with and had worked on successfully, especially a very similarly situated mine at Mineral Hill in Gardner. I'll go back here and show you. That is right here. So it was just directly west of Cook City, and again, very close, actually closer to the Yellowstone National Park. The Forest Service had processed the plan of operation, and the mine had operated successfully there, as it was at the time this was underway. So that was the Forest Service assumption, that there would be a parallel process. In 93, the EIS began, as I said, with the Gallatin and the Montana DEQ's leads. The Forest Service formed a task force, which was a collaborative process with the environmental groups and other agencies and the public. The task force actually gave significant roles to groups like the Great Yellowstone Coalition and Beartooth Alliance to actively participate in the review process. At that time, there were 10 formal cooperating agencies as part of the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act process. At that time, 23 agencies were involved. That grew, as I said, to 26. And we formed cooperating agency work groups on the issues. At this time in 93, there were 8,000 people on the mailing list. We developed newsletters, which was to keep the public informed. The whole process was subject to the state of Montana and the Montana governor, who was that time was Mark Roscoe's policy that all meetings and information, including drafts, would be available to public. So it was entirely daylight. And the company, Crown Butte Mines, Inc., was, at the same time this was going on, was doing active reclamation at the site. They were aware they needed to get the public's support for their project to go ahead because of the controversy that was growing. So they were voluntarily doing a lot of site cleanup, which because of the previous mining I mentioned, it needed. From 94 to 95, there were a number of draft EIS delays. The cooperating agencies, which EPA and the Park Service, Yellowstone National Park, were given unprecedented opportunity to comment. So a lot of the delays was waiting for them, which they took full advantage of. The National Park Service, for example, submitted a 30-page single-space list of comments on a 50-page double-spaced chapter in our EIS. cooperating agencies' delay in comments really drug the process out, especially, as I said, from the EPA and the Park Service. And then there was a government furlough. All the Forest Service people were laid off for a while, and funding became an issue. Public and political issues started really growing. During that time, Sherm and I and a few others thought that because one of our alternatives for the tailings was going to look at subaqueous design, that it would be worthwhile to investigate to various sites where this technique had been used. It was at the Louvercore mine in Canada, as well as various places in Norway, where the government agencies there told us they were successfully using it. So we went there to investigate and ended up writing a report on that, which became part of our analysis. Before I go further, I wanted to show you some examples of how the project was viewed. The opponents to the project were well funded, and they put out a number of publications claiming that the risk that this project posed to Yellowstone National Park was unprecedented. And they said it was an existential threat to the park. It would be catastrophic if this project went forward. So that really started us focusing on what is the actual risk of this project and how can it be designed so that risk is minimized. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in August 1995, somewhat to our surprise because we weren't party to it, President Clinton announced a 2-year segregation of the area from new mining claims. And then in 1996, the New York Times editorialized 6 times against the project. The draft EIS wasn't even out yet. We were working on preliminary drafts. And I think we issued 3 preliminary draft EIS, which were part for internal review. But they were strongly opposed to it even before the analyses had come out. And then Department of Interior contacted the United Nations World Heritage Committee and invited them out to hold a hearing on the project while we were still trying to get the analysis done, which they held at Mammoth in Yellowstone National Park. And both Sherm and I testified at the committee hearing. We asked them to hold off forming judgment and coming out with a statement until at least we had an analysis out so the public could see what the impacts would be, but they went ahead and issued a declaration that this posed a tremendous threat. The project posed a tremendous threat against the environment. Because of this ongoing discussion and debate about the actual risk, in April 1996, we became aware of an engineering risk analysis process called failure modes effects analysis. It had been used by the by NASA, by the Atomic Energy Commission, by Ford Motor Company, by British Columbia, BC Hydro for evaluation of dams. It was used as a way of analyzing all sorts of major projects, and it works by dividing the project into individual components and looking at the risk of each component, each part of the design, and then ways to reduce that risk down to acceptable levels. So we thought that had merit for this project. It had been used on a couple of mine projects, but we thought this would be a prime case for it. We put out a contract and asked for bids. We got, I think, 6 bids, and we ended up selecting a world-renowned engineering firm, which was out of Vancouver, British Columbia. It was Clone Crippen, and they began the analysis. And they went through several reviews. They put together a team of experts, of engineers and the like, and environmental experts. They began analyzing the plan of operation. We asked them to look at each alternative, especially the tailings, and tell us which ones were the lowest risk, and also asked them to come up with a better alternative if their team could do that. We also asked them to put it in layman's terms so that everyone could understand what they meant when they were quantifying this risk. Risk is, by the way, is defined as the likelihood of occurrence of something and the consequences of it. In May 1996, the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management began working on a withdrawal EIS for the entire area, 22,000 acres. The BLM filed for the withdrawal, filed the application without Forest Service's involvement, but the Forest Service was required at some point to do the EIS to analyze the withdrawal. So that was going on while we're still working on the mine EIS. In June 1996, the Secretary of Agriculture, Glickman, reserved the authority to make the decision on the mine project, and he cited the level of public interest. Normally, the person who would approve this would be the forest supervisor. In this case, it would be the Gallatin Forest Supervisor. We were asked to fly back to Washington, D.C., which Sherman, I, and some others did, and met with the Secretary of Agriculture and briefed him on the project. Took a three-dimensional model into the White House. In July 1996, we were working on the third preliminary review draft EIS, which, as I said, was 800 pages, and it was sent to cooperating agencies. We met in Denver, Montana, Gallatin National Forest, myself and Sherm, and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. We met with EPA and all the other agencies that had mentioned, the 26 cooperating. And the purpose of the meeting was to gather more information. And we agreed out of the meeting that we would get more data on the groundwater quality and quantity wetlands. And our target was to issue the draft EIS in fall of 1996. EPA insisted on a risk assessment in the draft EIS, which fit in with our efforts at that point to do just that thing, as I mentioned with the failure modes effects analysis. In August of 96, the New World buyout agreement was announced, which the administration, led by the Council of Environmental Quality, Katie McGinty and her deputy, Ray Clark, were heavily involved in, as well as other high-level administration officials. Janet Potts was the lead for the Department of Agriculture. And they initiated a formal appraisal of the area, and the net result was they came up with an estimate of $65 million net, which would propose to be transmitted to Crown Butte Mines Incorporated in property is what they worked on. And 22.5 of that 65 million would be used for site restoration. And Crown Butte Mines, as part of the agreement, was to deliver title to all the lands, including Margaret Reeves. Margaret Reeves was an elderly retired school teacher who lived in Livingston, Montana. She had deep roots in the Crown Butte New World Mining District. Her father and other relatives were miners who had staked some of these claims, and she wound up owning a good part of the interest. So Crown Butte agreed to deliver the interest they had, as well as Margaret Reeves. And Grady Yellowstone Coalition, who was the leading environmental group, agreed to enter into a consent decree on the Clean Water Act suit they had filed against Crown Butte Mines on the historic mine discharge. That was all part of the New World Agreement. The agency work on permits was supposed to be suspended pending consummation of the agreement. The administration agreed, however, that the failure mode effects analysis would continue, but the state of work was ordered to be changed. We were told by the administration to change it and to focus on the withdrawal EIS risk issues and training. The CEQ set up 4 teams then in September 96. It was an executive team that was in charge of implementing this agreement of CEQ, Department of Interior, Department of Justice, who had, 5 or 6 attorneys involved, and the Forest Service as well, and many of these were political appointees. It was a team that was supposed to identify properties for transference, There was a withdrawal action team, and there was a site restoration consent decree team that were formed. But one thing that got lost along the way was the commitment to involve Margaret Reed and to tie her lands up. She said, nobody talks to me. And you can see by the photos, she was a very admirable woman, strong-willed, and she said, that I'm not party to any such agreement. She owned more than 50% of it. She was not in the purchase agreement, and an analysis that Sherm and I did showed that she probably had the wherewithal to develop a small mine on her property separate from Crown Butte. So she said, no deal, no sale. That kind of put a wrench in the ringer, the stick in the spokes. That continued as a side issue with Crown Butte working with her to try to come to resolution. Governor Roscoe had a roundtable meeting where a lot of us met from all the different agencies and those teams that I listed as part of what was called the Montana Initiative, which was to try to do the deal internally in Montana. Plum Creek Timber Company was involved, Wesco Coal, and we were trying to find coal, timber, and Forest Service land assets to come up to the $65 million. There were public meetings on the Montana Initiative. There was strong opposition from the enviros. Industry liked it. In May 97, the final failure modes effects analysis risk assessment came out. There was a draft executive summary that came out first, and we had asked for that. We'd asked for a draft executive summary that would condense the risk and put it in terms that the layman could understand. And when we received it, Dick is going to talk more about this, but it caused quite a furor because it had findings that were not consistent with the way it was being portrayed politically, the risk of the project. The engineering analysis said that it was low risk, and they related it to other type comparable risks, but they rated it far below things like dams for power generation and the like. They thought it could be well mitigated, and the political appointees, caused quite an uproar amongst them. They said it was too conclusory, and we were ordered to go back to the engineering firm and to have them make some edits in it to take out those conclusions and make it more of a training document and to focus on the withdrawal EIS and to de-emphasize the mine part of it. In July 97, the final withdrawal EIS was issued, so the whole area and signed by the Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and it was meant that the entire area could no longer be open to mining whatsoever, including the newly acquired lands through the agreement. And the EIS, by the way, relied on the preliminary draft EIS, which was not allowed to be finalized for the mine project, as well as the failure modes effects analysis, which did come out. And in August through October of 97, there were various bills for purchase and implementation of the buyout agreement using Land and Water Conservation Fund. And it came out of the House and Senate Committee for $65 million in cash. Of that, as I said, $22.5 million for restoration, $12 million for the Beartooth Highway repair and maintenance, $10 million to Montana and mineral interests, principally in coal, 3 coal tracts down in the Ashland area of southeastern Montana. As I said, the appraisal had been done on that. Well, there were 6 months of hearings that went on it, and there were valuation issues on the whole thing. There was a general accounting office audit. Margaret Reed's values versus Crown Butte's were part of that. The value method was used for the appraisal. Finally, as I said earlier, in October 97, Margaret Reed agreed with Crown Butte Mines that there would be no mine on her lands until Congress and the President agreed. Those are Margaret's words. And that was construed as a conservation easement, restrictive use, no mines related. And we were told by Department of Justice at that point to get rid of all of Crown Butte Mines data that they had gathered on the geological potential in the site. And I don't know if that happened. A good part of the samples and so forth, I think, were hauled to dumps. Margaret Reed did keep fee title to her lands. It was just with this subject, this conservation easement. And there was a question at the time if the agreement that they formed with Reed would be acceptable to the Department of Justice. Ultimately, they agreed. Great Yellowstone Coalition in November '97 sent a letter to the president, President Clinton, that they will pull out of the buyout agreement and a consent decree unless the president line item vetoes the coal to Montana. The president was actively considering that in '97, and there was disputes that went on over the whole agreement about whether the law allows veto and so on. And the agreement with Margaret lingered until finally it did get consummated. This is a copy of the warranty deed, which was ceremonial. It was presented when the president and his wife Hillary and Chelsea came out, and we met with them at Baronet Peak, and this was the deed that was transferred to him. And that's it in a nutshell.
Big
A large nutshell.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, John. So I was wondering if you could give us a bit more background on how what became this controversial report, where it came from, and how that bubbled up.
Okay, that was about the time, a little before that I had become the director, and so I got kind of involved in it, and it ended up with we received a draft assessment, which we looked at it, and it really surprised us. We were really pleasantly surprised that the risk associated with this was negligible, and to the point that it used analogies like the likelihood of it was probably less than being struck by lightning or being killed in an elevator accident. And so there was really no risk. And of course, that was just counter to where the administration was on this whole thing. And so I remember going to Dick and I says, we'd like to continue this with the study. We'd already spent probably close to $200,000 on that at that point. And so we thought that it would be good if we could get the results. Now we didn't realize the reaction was going to be so strong on the negligible effects, and so we were going to try to we chose, and we were already way into the process. So it's not like we just completed it, I guess, what it amounted to, so that we could learn something from it and see what we had done well and what we had not done well. Of course, and I remember what we were going to all agree to, we were going to do that and what have you. And then Dick will get into, as we got that part, it began to really explode because they saw this, and Janet Potts, secretary's office, was so nervous about that, and Dick and other folks ended up going back in there, and he can get into that portion of it. What I was going to add too is that the reaction by, and I, as supervisor on the Gallatin, I'm quite aware of the Yellowstone Coalition and the Park Service, and I've had very good friends that I worked with that were park superintendents and what have you. But we had a particular park superintendent, Mike Finley, and the Yellowstone Coalition were really energizing this whole thing with the administration, and so that became kind of the focus. And so we got away from the reality of all of the facts. We were now into the other portion of the item, and of course the administration selected that as one of their environmental projects that they wanted to showcase, and so they could not have anybody come up and say that wasn't a terrible thing that they were trying to resolve. In all of my 35 years that I was with the Forest Service, I have never seen anything blow up quite so much. And we move away from facts, but get into the real politics of it. And we went through some real politics. But the other thing, though, Sherm might be able to talk also about, which is very important, I think, is the cooperation that we had with all the different agencies involved in the state and everybody else. And so I want to say that there was a universal acceptance by where we were going with this thing, except for the political part that came in at the last. But Sherm, you might go ahead and go into that part of it if you want to.
Okay, well, whenever we get a proposal like the plan of operations we got from the company, it triggers usually under NEPA, National Environment Policy Act, for us to do an environmental impact statement. And it also, state of Montana has authority over any of those kind of projects within the boundary of Montana. So we ended up with cooperating with state of Montana on a project. State of Montana has the authority to have the company pay for a third-party contractor to write the environmental impact statement. So we jointly picked a contractor to write the thing. The Forest Service developed a team of resource specialists, hydrologists, soil scientists, wildlife, economists, and all kinds of every different resource you can think of, civil engineers, construction engineers, and they would work with their partners in the Department of Environmental Quality to review the project and to review the work from the third-party contractor. So it was quite a process. We did that for 3, 4, 5 years and had all kinds of information. Cooperating agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey would review our work, and they were up there doing water quality monitoring samples, and went on and on. So we had all kinds of great information. Park Service could review, the EPA would review the water quality, and
U.S. Bureau of Mines.
Bureau of Mines. We had all kinds of how many?
26.
26
It ended up.
cooperating agencies involved in that. So,
I have a question.
Some were not so cooperative.
yeah, some were not so cooperative.
So I just have a question. Was it standard practice to go to a third party for this type of report, or was this a special scenario where you or somebody or everybody determined that it would be great to have another set of eyes outside of the agency?
Well, if you're talking about the third-party contractor that was going to write the EIS or develop the EIS for us, it's pretty standard if on a larger project like this, especially when it involves the state, because they are able to have the company pay for the third-party contract.
Gotcha.
But the third-party contractor is selected by the agencies. The company doesn't have a say.
Right.
So the Forest Service and the state of Montana selected the third party as an independent, and they would bring experts as well as, in addition to the ones that the Forest Service had involved in it. So there was a very large group of experts involved in these kind of studies.
I see. So it was a big undertaking to make sure this was on doing your due diligence. So how does that process play out?
How does the EIS process? The contractor would generate a preliminary draft and then would send that to the lead agencies, which, as Sherm said, was the Forest Service and Montana Department of Environmental Quality. And those two would review it and provide comments back to the contractor, who would then make revisions. And part of that review by each of the agencies would be to have their various specialists look at those sections. Wildlife biologists would look at the biology section, the Endangered Species Act section, so on. And as we would, in addition, if there were sections that we thought particularly ought to be reviewed, or other agencies who were cooperating, like EPA or Park Service, we would send sections to them as well to review. Generally, anything to do with water, other agencies wanted to review those as well. They would feed the comments back to the Forest Service and DEQ, who would then provide those on to the contractor, who would then respond. I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
International Heart Institute.
Okay, so you were talking about the EIS process. Where were we at in that?
Let me turn this off.
And I might just add too, when you get to that.
Yeah.
That the risk assessment was on top of all of that. So when we went through the risk assessment, that was in addition to it.
That tiered into the
Yeah,
EIS
yeah,
process.
Yeah,
But,
tiered in, but it was,
so where do you want me to start?
Where were we?
I'm sorry.
no,
Well,
I
you
think,
can- yeah, you
Want
can just
me to
pick
go?
back up. Or Sherm, I cut you off.
yeah,
originally
Sherman,
with my
maybe
question.
Sherman.
Yeah. You were in the middle of talking about all of that, if you wanted to pick that back up.
Yeah, well, I think we were instructed to kind of halt and desist on the draft EIS about the time it got real controversial.
Yeah, well, we were told to keep working on the preliminary draft EIS, but not to finalize it, not to let it get out. I actually got a call at home. I think I was a GS-12 at the time, lowly person, and from Ray Clark, who was the deputy director at the CEQ. He called me at home here in Missoula and asked me about the status of it. I told him what it was. He wanted me to give a copy to an environmental group. I told him, attorneys had told me that it was working papers, that it was not subject to FOIA and not to give it out. And he was very assertive in saying, by golly, he wanted it to go to the Great Yellowstone Coalition. And we kind of went back and forth. I think ultimately he did get it to them. So they, behind the scenes, unknown to us, were also reviewing and providing comments back in on it. But the preliminary draft EIS was as far as we got. We never really were allowed to go to a draft EIS, which is a formal step where it goes out for public review for everyone to comment on it. The preliminary draft was reviewed ultimately by these cooperating agencies, and that was it. There was no final document. Does that cover what you
That's correct.
wanted?
Okay, so what happens next?
What happened after the preliminary draft?
Who would like to
Oh.
take it from there?
What I was just gonna say, to add into what I mentioned earlier, is that this draft assessment got in the hands of the administration, and that created a real blow up.
The draft risk assessment.
Risk assessment. or
Not
risk-
the draft EIS.
No, draft risk assessment did that. And then that's when Dick really got involved because, and Dick, you take from there, because that,
Okay, my turn, I guess. First thing I'd like to do is thank you, Mike, for your presentation. I learned things that I didn't know about, a tremendous amount of stuff.
we all did.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it was a monumental in my career too. I've had other big projects that were very controversial, but this would be the peak. And as a result, I have 6 large boxes of documents, personal records that I have, as well as all this stuff that I saved for 26 years.
Well, I was a very late comer in the process. And I probably came in on a late 95, 96, somewhere in there. And what was going on is Mike Finley was really tearing up our forest in terms of the
Director of the park,
work.
Yellowstone National Park.
National Park. Yeah, he was, yeah.
Superintendent.
Yep. And there were newspaper articles saying that the EIS process was flawed. The quality of work by the people was terrible. And then the thing that really got me involved was an article in the Bozeman paper where Hal was the regional forester told Mike that, why don't you take care of your elk numbers in the park and let me deal with the mine. And after that thing blew up, Hal got a phone call from Jack Ward Thomas, the chief. And the chief said, Hal, you've only been in your job for 6 months and here you are in a terrible problem. So when he got done, Hal came to tell me about this. And I said, Hal, why don't you just keep your head down and I'll take the lead in this because I'm close to retirement. And then about the same time, the forest supervisor on the Gallatin stumbled across a meeting between CEQ and the Yellowstone Coalition. And it became obvious that at that point in time, that CEQ was pretty directly involved in the campaign President Clinton's campaign.
Was that Dave Garber, the supervisor?
Yes,
Dave Garber.
Dave Garber. And and the leader of CEQ was Katie McGinty. So she was really in the driver's seat and, in touch with the administration regularly. About that same time, as I remember, I was told that the Secretary of Agriculture had appointed Janet Potts to be our handler. And I was told by Janet that I was to directly work with her on anything related to the Crown Butte mine. The big thing that happened, she called me on the phone and said, Richard, the president's going to make an announcement to buy the mine. He's going to do that in the national park. And we want you to attend, and you are to bring 8 uniformed officers with you to this announcement. And when we got there, they had chairs set aside from the main group for all of us in uniform to sit. And then there was a little stage up front. The president was up there for his remarks, and the Yellowstone Coalition members were there, and some of the Park Service members. The chief and Janet Potts were sitting directly in front down on the ground. And as comments were made that related to the Forest Service, the crowd would turn and look at all of us over on that side. So then the meeting broke up, and the President Clinton, came over to me and he said, I'm sorry about this, but it looks like you guys were on the shit end of the stick on this one. And then right then, as we were breaking up, I had a meeting with Jack Ward Thomas and Janet Potts. And I told them about the work we were wanting to do and the work we were doing on the risk assessment. And Janet Potts says, no, you should not be doing that. Should not be doing that. And Jack Ward Thomas says, I totally support that effort. I think it's a good one. It wasn't long after that, probably Janet reported that to Katie McGinty, that I got a call from Katie McGinty. And she said, the risk analysis you're doing is not your job. That's our job to do oversight. So send the money to me. And I said, no, we are looking at our own work and are going to continue to do that. So that was my first time to kind of get going in a trouble spot with CEQ. The next thing that happened was Mark Roscoe, governor of Montana, had been dealing a lot in the press and with other issues with the mine and the project. And he was going to have public meetings. That was his plan. And I got a call from Janet Potts and said, Richard, I'm sure you can't get the governor to cancel the meeting, but would you be willing to try? And I said, no, and you shouldn't be asking me to do that because I am not a political appointee. So things are not going well again between me and the administration.
The politicals.
The other thing we did with the risk analysis, when it came to the meeting, when the representative brought it to the regional office to show us what had happened and everything, the risk assessment was using statistical data that was very, very difficult to understand. And I said, could you change that and put that stuff in terms that the average person can understand? So when it came back to us, it was things like, this is equivalent to being killed on an elevator at some point in time in your life, rather than this is a 1 in 10,000, 20,000 chances. Then the next thing that happened as a result of that is that a copy got to Janet Potts. And she called me on the phone and said, Richard, you need to destroy all of the documents. And at this point in time, they were draft documents. That's important. They weren't original documents. And I was caught in the driveway of my home burning a couple of documents. My son came home from high school and said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm burning these documents." He says, "I can't believe you would do that." Well, but a lot of the documents found a home in somebody else's pocket. And they're still around today.
Still here.
Dick,
Mhm.
just curious, why did she want you to burn those documents? What was it
It
that
was
was
because-
so?
Yeah, she accused me, they accused me, both of them, Janet Potts and CEQ, of setting out to embarrass the president. And that document would have been an embarrassing document for the administration. And, you know, I wasn't going to just put it out in public, but I was always operating with the assumption that it would gain access through the Freedom of Information Act and people could see it. So I wanted it to be seen.
Could I, just on that issue, who would have embarrassed? Actually, the president was relying on what he was being told by CEQ and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and others. And, you know, they were putting out things like this: catastrophic flood of toxic mine waste threatens Yellowstone's Lamar Valley, or New World Mine, that the real story about catastrophic effects, is always also relying on, my opinion, politicized agency comments, particularly from EPA. Mines acid test headline. In this article, if you read it, Wes Wilson, who was a scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency, was quoted as saying that this deposit project area was the most acidic generating of any in the world. It was the highest and worst that could be, which is a bald-faced falsehood on its face. There are plenty of other deposits that are even more potentially acid generating than this one, but that's the sort of information that was out there that was characterizing and poisoning our efforts to stick to the effort. Also, Mine from Hell threatens Yellowstone. Again, it was one of the environmental groups put that out. And by the way, I mean, besides the Forest Service being under the gun, the state of Montana was as well, because Mike Finley with the Park Service and others were taking shots at the state of Montana and their work. And the governor at the time, Mark Roscoe, also was involved in the debate. Governor Mark Roscoe, he was firing back at Finley and pointing out the politicization of his statements. So sorry, I just wanted to add that.
No, that's good. That's good. The next thing that happened is that CEQ organized a team to look at the alternatives for raising that $65 million. And so I spent 3 days with a group, all kinds of people from the Justice Department, BLM, all kinds of things. And we looked at these alternatives. And one of the alternatives was a Plum Creek proposal to buy 150,000 acres of land on the Helena National Forest for $65 million. And as the committee worked through all the alternatives, Ray Clark, the CEQ head of this committee, came to me and say, "Okay, Richard, what's the Forest Service opinion on that?" And I said, "I'm opposed to this action because of the precedents that it will establish. And it also results in less money going to the county that was federal funds, because it would be taxed now as timberland. So I'm opposed." He says, "You screwed it up." And at that point in time, everybody, Yellowstone Coalition, everybody was in favoring that alternative. So that kind of got to the end of the meeting, and Ray Clark says, "Okay, we need to break it up." He says, "We need to have this understanding. Nobody is going to say anything, make comment to anybody until I've had a chance to talk to the administration. So no comments." I went to my room to pack my bags, and then I walked back down to the meeting room because I'd been with these guys for 3 days, so I wanted to say goodbye. And I walked into the room, and Ray Clark says, "Richard, I just met with the Yellowstone Coalition who's here in the hotel with us and told them what you did, and they said you have queered the deal." So you can imagine I spent the entire weekend on the telephone. And then the next thing that happened very close to that, and I'm not sure what the source was, but we got a source from the Justice Department who read about some comments that Katie McGinty was going to provide in testimony that was requested by Barbara Cubans, the senator of Wyoming. And what she was going to say is the administration had no choice but to intervene because of the long history that the Forest Service had with a close relationship with the mining industry. When I got that word, I called Janet Potts, and I says, "You need to tell Katie McGinty that if she testifies in this regard, I will personally go to 60 Minutes. Make sure you tell her that." Then the world blew up. We were all ordered to be in Washington the next Monday morning at 7:30.
And when you say all of us, you mean me and Sherm and you and Hal Salvas
Right.
and Doug McClellan,
And
5 of us.
we got there, and I remember at 6:30 in the morning, Hal and I walking all over the compounds in the Capitol, just thinking about what this was all about. And then I don't know who was there from the department, but I had to meet with other people. And
I don't think anyone from the department was there. My recollection is we met with Jack Blackwell initially, and maybe whoever was the executive assistant. And then after that was when some of us, Sherm and me and Doug McCullough, were ordered to go to the department to meet with Janet Potts.
And Hal and I had to meet with the woman from somewhere. I don't know where she was.
Oh,
And that was where when it all started, that was our first 7:30 meeting. And
Jack Blackwell was acting, was he?
he
Acting
was.
chief?
Yeah, Jack Blackwell was acting.
yeah.
Chief.
So then they had to do a formal investigation of me, and had a guy flew out, and he was from the department. And then after that, I got a reprimand that we were talking about, and Hal told me, he says, "I did not want to do this. I do not like it, but I was ordered to do it." And then that was kind of the end. I had to retire early because the word around the agency was that I was going to be moved out of my position. So what I did is retired and ran away and jumped on a sailboat for 9 years and saw the world. Done.
Well, Sherm and I continued to
Mike,
work. Go ahead.
Could you maybe discuss the appraisal and how the 65 million came about and what that was for?
Sure. The appraisal was done according to regulations which have specific requirements on how particularly appraisals for federal land acquisitions and disposals will be done. And they value it using 3 methods: income, comparable sales, and remember what the third one is? Income approach. Anyway, using those 3 methods,
Yeah.
they hired a firm that was out of the Black Hills of South Dakota who was experienced in doing appraisal of mineral properties. It was the Widows, WIDDOS, John Widows, I think, was the principal. So he contacted Sherm and me and wanted all the documents we had that related to the mineral reserves and land status, and we worked with them to come up with the appraisal. And they came up with, I think it was 68 or 69 million, but if you deducted certain things, that was where the 65 million came from. And that was based, I think they used the comparable sales approach, meaning like situated. properties what they would have gone for on the open market. But after Dick retired and left, Sherman and I continued on. We both had involvement until we retired in the project, although by then it was moving into the reclamation stage. It went on to using the funds, the $22.5 million, to clean it up, and it was very successful restoration efforts. The things that the company had started were continued on, and it looks great today. I was up there not that long ago. In spite of it being a red mountain that's going to bleed red for eternity, it is reclaimed probably about as well as it could be.
You know, one thing I forgot is that there was an occasion when Jack Ward Thomas, when we were getting all the stuff from Mike Finley, trouble, he contacted his counterpart in Washington in the Park Service, and to see if he could get Mike to calm down a little. And his counterpart said, "No way, he's working with the administration. I'm out of the park."
I have a handwritten memo that not very long. I'd like to read it. It's from Jack Ward Thomas. It's got his stamp, and it's to Roger Kennedy with the National Park Service. It says, "Roger, Finley is at it again. He's really getting on my guy's nerves. This pissing match with Governor Roscoe and hate at the EIS, several of which are read wrong, are not productive. We are working hard to get all the agencies concerned taken care of. We don't really need any more of this from Finley." I was on the Gallup National Forest last week and was enticed by a reporter to cover words with Mr. Finley. I declined with the comment that the Forest Service does not, as a matter of policy, debate differences with other agencies in the press. I was promised, and Secretary Glickman was promised, that this type of debate in the press would cease. The Forest Service will not respond to the Park Service's comments. It would not be, if to do so would be unprofessional and harmful, but I hope such will cease. Signed, Jack Ward Thomas, Chief, Forest Service. In response to that, as Dick said, things didn't change much. Finley stuck to his guns. He apparently had political connection enough, and the raging back and forth, particularly with the state of Montana, went on. Did Finley get promoted afterwards?
I have no idea.
I don't know either.
You mentioned the pissing contest with Roscoe. What is the state of Montana's interest in all of this? I mean, what was he really trying to get done? You know, was it just all political posturing, or?
Well, a lot of it was same way in Wyoming, with jobs related with the mine, and then also the politics of that coal stuff too. There are a whole bunch of the arrangement stuff that he was frustrated with.
Montana has a severance tax that applies to hard rock minerals as well as coal and that. So there was income from taxes as well as direct employment, as Dick said. So there was an economic benefit to the state. But Montana has a constitution as well as statutory requirements and state law that requires them to follow the laws, the state laws. They have MEPA, the Montana Environmental Policy Act, and various statutes that require them to diligently and in good faith process projects that are proposed and to honor property rights, which this was. I mean, this was not public land. Some of it was, but most of it was private lands that was looking to be developed. So the governor was coming from that standpoint. And I think he was more supported, his administration then was more supportive of commodities than perhaps subsequent ones, meaning he supported development of Montana is called the treasure state, and that's partly due to the vast mineral wealth, but he was supportive of development of timber and grazing and minerals and so on.
One of the things I might just add is that the what Mike and SHRM had developed would have done as well as any reclamation effort that was all part of the actual mine design, was to reclamate many of these areas. And so when this was tossed out, or given that we gave this up, it cost now the taxpayer millions of dollars now that had to come from other sources, as opposed to allowing the mining to do the very same thing. And so I think that's one of those hidden costs that it really goes unspoken about. And that really did cost, I think, I have no figure to add to that, but I think that the mine itself, the design would have done an awful lot toward the reclamation, or as much as what is done now, and at no cost, because they would have made it part of the operation.
I think you're exactly right. And one example of that is what happened with the Cook City tailings that are used to be in Soda Butte Creek. I mentioned that were from historic mining that was long before there were regulations and laws in place that would have forbidden it. All of that was removed, and it actually had significant residual gold in it, metals, and it was hauled down, I think, to the Golden Sunlight mine, where it was put in their engineeringly designed tailings impoundment, but not before they extracted the gold from it, which helped pay for some of the costs of the reclamation. And the company, Crown Butte Mines, was actually proposing to do something similar with the old dumps up at the mine site and the McLaren mine.
Something I think I forgot to say, when the Yellowstone announcement was taking place and we were supposed to be there, that was the opening day of the Republican convention on the West Coast. So it was all associated with the presidential campaign.
Yeah, the ceremony where they celebrated the purchase and the buyout agreement was at Baronet Peak, just inside the park, the northern boundary. Sherman and I were invited to go there. That's where we had our pictures taken with President Clinton and his wife Hillary and his daughter Chelsea, who happened to be just south of there on vacation, who came up for the ceremony. But besides them, there were other luminaries like John Denver was there. He actually rode on the bus with us. There were a lot of Hollywood types that were also weighing in on the side of the buyout.
And so remind me, how did they eventually get that money together? I mean, it was some sort of land swaps or exchanges or sales, or where did that 65 million emanate from eventually? Does anybody?
That's a good question. I think
I thought it was appropriated dollars that came out of the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
I think
That's
so.
ultimately
I think so.
where there was too much controversy about the land deals. It was always someone's ox being gored about, oh, you're going to surplus those Forest Service lands. We can't have that. So it was just no deal was acceptable to everyone. And the coal deal, I'm quite sure did go through, which was a sweetener to the state of Montana, because Montana was being harmed through this by the lost revenue of severance taxes and so on, where the coal lands, the coal rights, I think it was 3 sections of land in Otter Creek, which is a prolific coal area in southeastern Montana.
There were major issues there with the tribes over the coal issue. People on both sides of that.
Yeah, that was adjacent.
Yeah.
And even now, the state had looked at leasing that, and I don't know that got anywhere. There was a lot of talk about it, but that hasn't gotten off the ground. Northern Cheyenne Reservation is right adjacent to it, and it does, I don't think it quite gets onto Forest Service lands, but it's right in the Otter Creek drainage.
Well, you talked about the immediate effects of it, but did this change essentially how these things go forward? I mean, was there from this point forward a different feel to these types of procedures and mining claims and projects and stuff like that? Or is this a Clinton story? I mean, is this, did things become more political in a permanent way after this? Or was this kind of like, you know, you got an election year, if this weren't so close to Yellowstone, if this were just a mine in North Dakota, would anybody have kicked up a fuss about it, you know? What do you think about, you know, how do we explain why this happened, but it didn't happen in other places, you know?
Well, certainly the proximity to Yellowstone was the sales point for the environmental groups. That's how they got all the attention, and it greatly boosted their membership and contributions. So they really grew after that. But I would say it's continued that trend. It's emboldened them, and they've used the same approach with other projects, in my experience, including the two in northwestern Montana, which happen to be world-class deposits of silver, copper under the wilderness area. They have used the same approach there. And again, the politics have gotten involved again at the national level. When I was in Washington, D.C., as assistant director, I met with people like a fellow who was the director of Tiffany's, who had politicized against these two projects out in Montana, neither of which, of course, he really visited. And the New York Times again was editorializing, and the interest at the national level was drawn to projects out in Montana that were following the process. Those two projects, by the way, I don't want to get off the subject, but I'm very familiar with those, and I've worked with those since I was a budding trainee geologist in about 1967. So I've had a long time involvement with those two as well, having gone more analysis, I believe, than the proposed nuclear repository in Nevada. This is for a mine project that's gone, and it's because of the political emphasis it draws. People point at old mining projects like Butte, and they say, oh my God, that's going to be in wilderness, so that's going to be in Yellowstone. Of course, those are historic features long before there were regulations, and they also are different types of deposits altogether. They don't happen like that anymore. No? There have been some mine projects that have gone bad, that not many Forest Service, but a few, where the Forest Service didn't have the staffing and experience really to regulate them the way they should. Forest Service had the authority, we just didn't have the expertise. But at least during my tenure, we tried to grow that. You can have the best regulations in the world and the best laws and well-meaning, but if you don't have the expertise to enforce it, you go nowhere. It's like having laws on the books saying this is against the law, but if you fire your police department, it doesn't do you no good. We know how that works out.
One to watch right now that's going on is the Stibnite mine in Yellow Pine, Idaho, which is the proposal to have a 3,500 acre open pit mine and employ 1,500 people. And that decision, I think the EIS is supposed to come out within a few months.
I think there's a draft EIS already out.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with that project too. It's an old mining site, much like the New World site. It was actually mined for a while under the War Powers Act because it had minerals that the United States needed during World War II to fight the war. So stibnite was an important, tungsten and other related minerals were important for the war effort. So the U.S. government actually subsidized the mining that happened there, which left a historic mess. But the U.S. government had a hand in that. And the current proposal is to go in to, again, clean up that area, but to mine the valuable minerals as part of the process. And again, it's facing a lot of controversy. I don't know how it'll fare.
It was an active, they were trying to get that mine going again when I was on the ranger district over there. It was on my ranger district.
Is that right?
And they couldn't get it going because they were not willing to clean up the mess that had been left behind. And
well, it's since been declared a Superfund site, meaning under CERCLA, the Superfund enabling legislation, that there are certain waivers that can happen to the environmental laws to go forward for the cleanup. And as part of that, the company that wound up with the rights managed to get a waiver from EPA to do certain things there that they might not otherwise have been able to do in order to go forward with the project.
it's on the headwaters of the South Fork of the Salmon River. And one of the major players on that thing of concern are the Native Americans who invested $4 million trying to get that fishery restored, the Salmon River fishery. Now, what they're saying now is they're gonna reroute the stream to create water for the fish to move into right through the old work. And so it's I try to get on the internet regularly to
Follow that, yeah.
follow the politics of it.
Well,
Yeah.
what I recommended to them, I actually did some consulting on that. What I recommended to them was to do a failure modes effects analysis. I thought that would really help guide them in the risk to that project.
Yeah.
Very
I don't know
good.
if they did.
That's a good point.
Well, John, you've been unusually quiet.
Oh, no, this is,
Wake up.
no, wake up.
It's,
It's,
what would you add to this story?
Well, I might just add, when Dick retired, I retired too, just about the same time. So, and I didn't feel like I would have been, but still I was ready to retire. I think too, what is, we're going to work with this for quite some time. I'm sure the agency, all of the effects that you have from this kind of a thing and how it changes the process that you go through and the involvement of the states. And I just hope we can get by this a little bit where we can do the good for the country at the same time, be able to benefit from all of these things. I don't know, at some point in time, the New World Mine might somehow, I don't know if you can get it back, probably not.
No,
But it's just such a shame, that such a cost, and such a shame that we just so we fritter away that kind of a thing just for politics is what it really amounts to. But
Was that enough of a sour taste in your mouth to be the reason why you wanted to retire?
No,
or was
no.
already becoming time to retire?
It
Anyway?
was time for me to. I think all of us, you get at a point where you get beat, not beat. That's not the true statement, but you.
worn out.
Worn out. I think that's a nice way of putting it. Worn out, and it's nice to be able. But we have had our share in this region. Have had our share of controversy, and that getting into that mineral one was an interesting. We've had them in lands. We've had them in other areas that is, I think, is very.
This was also a time when one of my other jobs was trying to reduce the size of the regional office. So I created a bonus for everybody to leave and retire.
And that you remember I was the team leader on the team B that
I haven't
went
gotten
through
my
that.
bonus
Yeah.
check yet.
I have an additional thought and also a question for Sherm. But the additional thought is that, as I said, I actually retired a year ago. I did consulting for a variety of players for about 17 years. And one of the last things I did was as a consultant for the American Exploration and Mining Association, which is a trade association, mining. But I was helping them reply. The Biden administration had has an initiative that I think that's culminated on what they can do to improve permitting, particularly to help them achieve their green agenda, because there are a lot of strategic minerals that they can't do the green agenda, meaning electric vehicles and the like, without minerals. And I don't think they were quite aware until our input about how mining intensive their proposals are to build windmills, solar cells, electric vehicles and the like. You need lithium, graphite, and cobalt, yeah. Copper in particular, those 4 ingredients, and they need to be dug from the ground, and they require a lot of fossil fuels to dig them out, as well as impacts associated with them. I don't think that was the realization that is the trade-off. You can't really do one without the other. So that's been interesting to me, and I continue to be involved. The question I have for Sherm is, he's a battle-hardened veteran from big projects on the Gallatin, the Stillwater Mine Complex, which is going great guns, and it's a model mine. But the Mineral Hill Mine I mentioned earlier, it's even closer to Yellowstone National Park, and there's a major stream that flows right into the park. Why do you think we were able to get that permitted? How was that different than the New World Mine? Why did that work, but the other one
I
didn't?
was trying to think if the Greater Yellowstone Coalition existed then. I don't remember. But I think part of it was park supervisor.
Different park
I
supervisor,
think Barbie was
superintendent.
there.
Barbie,
And he was pretty well approachable.
John Townsley and
And
Barbie, yeah, both were.
So it didn't get politicized
Right.
the way the New World Mine did,
No, it didn't.
because it operated for a long time without any major flaps or anything. The Mineral
Like you
Hill
say,
Mine,
Bear Creek does run into Yellowstone Park, so right into it.
and their ore was an arsenopyrite, meaning it wasn't just pyrite, which is the mineral at issue at Crown Butte, but it had arsenic as part of the mix.
Arsenopyrite.
Arsenopyrite.
So it sounds like leadership is a lot of the story of, well, I guess there's only so much you can do when the president is leaning on you to do something and you're in an executive branch agency, right?
We got the feeling that it was related, it was political, meaning it was related to elections, and that
Yeah.
that was what was really behind the scenes. I mean, Vice President Gore was involved as well. I heard that a few times, that Vice President Al Gore was following this and involved, and he actually, from what I was told, was the mentor and had pushed for the selection of Katie McGinty in her position. In fact, we were in her office, and I remember seeing pictures with the vice president and her around on the shelves. Do you remember?
She and the vice president had a long-term working relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
that was a factor. I don't know
yeah,
what.
yeah.
It
And
was-
Gore,
I was
you
just
know,
a
was
peon.
already
Yeah.
grooming his image as
Sure.
environmental. That's his big
Yeah,
Yeah.
policy thing. Is that his big brand is now the environment, and it wouldn't
then he
have
ran
suited
for
him
president.
to build this mine and say there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
But it does look kind of cool to the environmentalists if you stick it to whoever.
it cemented their support, I'm
Right.
sure.
How did y'all feel about Jack Ward Thomas's behavior in this through all of this?
Well, I like Jack. I thought he was supportive of us. He was very articulate. I mean, he said things that made me laugh, but I thought were spot on. He told the environmentalists at one point, I was at a meeting where he said, "Why don't you accept the fact that you've won?" He said, "There's the battlefield and there are bodies everywhere. You beat the Forest Service, you won. All you're doing now is running around and bayoneting the wounded."
That's good.
And my other memory of Jack Ward Thomas, it's off the subject, but he invited us all to dinner one night, and we went out and we had a nice feed down at, I think it was Gallatin Gateway, and he ordered these expensive wines, and then he left and stiffed us with the bill. I should remind him of that.
That's why he was chief and you weren't. Huh? That's right.
You got anything you'd say, Sherm?
No, I don't think so.
You know, one of the things too that's interesting in this is going back to the beginning of the Forest Service. We were involved, what was it called? The Department of Lands, or I don't know what it was now, but we were in with Interior, and because of the politics, the Forest Service finally broke off. And we've always prided ourselves in being less hooked to politics than say it BLM, our counterpart, Interior. And when I worked in legislative affairs and so on, everything in the Department of Interior was all handled by lawyers in the department. Whereas in the Forest Service, we had talked about, it was myself and the person that was the head of range management or head of, and we understood the forest and what have you, but we could beat their pants off every time because we understood this whole situation. My point being is that the Interior has always been much more politicized than the Forest Service. And we were maybe a little spoiled because we weren't so politicized until something like this comes along. And now I think, I don't know how it's changing. I can't say that, but I'm going to guess we're a lot more politicized than we perhaps used to be.
Yeah.
We used to have more independence, but
Yeah.
one thing I'd like to say, that which I mentioned, we were sitting out at the table having coffee, was that the Forest Service regards its minerals and geology program in a particular light that's different than Department of Interior. I think it's much more integrated in Interior BLM than it is in the Forest Service. It's always been apart, and there was really no focus on minerals until the Forest Service passed regulations in 1974. So the program really started in 74. As a result, it's always been small and not gotten much emphasis. many of our projects, I mentioned the ones up on the Kootenai National Forest and even the Crown Butte one, have values in the billions of dollars. And we've had a skeleton crew really running it. I mean, there was Sherm, maybe a couple others on the Gallatin. That was another reason we had to contract. And the Kootenai similar. If it had been $1 billion timber sale, we would have had an army. But minerals, we've always felt like we were discriminated against and treated without much respect, and that never quite accepted. I always got reminded of that this is the Forest Service and you're not a forester.
I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting, yeah.
Did you feel that way, Sherm? In your neck of the woods?
Yes, I do. And I think a lot of people in the Forest Service don't understand how complicated the mineral thing is and
Oh, yeah.
what it takes to get a mine developed. So,
It's the
You know-
most complicated program by far from the legal standpoint. I can rattle off the laws that apply from the technical standpoint and from the environmental standpoint. Technically, I mean just the design of the facilities. They're so variable and complex because the ore bodies are different and complex and environmentally complex. So those three things, you won't find it anywhere with any other program.
When I was district ranger, North Fork, gold prices went soaring up to like $1,200 an ounce. So we had all these miners on their mining claims just swamping the forest. And we didn't have access to people like yourself that just weren't there. So we were having to do the permits on this thing, and we just didn't know how to deal. You couldn't say no to stuff because you didn't have a background to do it. Well, when that thing blew up, I knew this guy down the Salmon River who had a cherry orchard, and I was visiting him with something. He told me, he says, I used to be in the mining business. And I remembered that. So I went down and I said, what do you know about mining? What's your history? He says, I was a mine superintendent in South America on 2 different mines, put my whole career there. I says, would you come work for me? I'll give you a GS7. And he came and he turned that mining problem completely over. My problem was getting enough coffee for the miners that were down in the basement with this guy. Because he could go out there and say, no, that's not the right thing to do. You need to do this. But it just completely changed
Interesting.
our view of the mining industry.
Well, I spent a good part of my career in the Forest Service educating the Forest Service employees, the people out on the districts and that, about the legal standing, because there was this big misconception, widespread, that we couldn't say no, that if you had a mining claim under the 1872 mining law, that overrode everything, and the Forest Service couldn't stop you. That's flatly untrue. Forest Service has ample regulatory authority, which I worked on manual and regulatory change to make it that clear so that people would know it. So I count that as a success. The other thing is training. I was part of developing national training for the Forest Service minerals administrators, which some are geologists, some are foresters, but we sent them to training down in Arizona so that they would know the regulations and they would know the natures of a mining project, and they would get certified. They would get this administrative certification so they could go out and administer a project. I count that as moving us towards more successful managing of these issues. But as I said earlier, a lot of these problems are self-inflicted because we do have the authority. We just don't have the staff or the training needed. And I'm afraid right now we're in another valley where we've lost the expertise. We've lost the ability really to regulate well. That's why I've contracted so long. It's because they didn't replace me when I retired. They still hired me. Sorry, I know I'm going on too long.
No, that's good.
All these things come to your mind, I keep thinking that North Fork too. The other thing we had all these mining claims, and we couldn't contest the mining claims because we only had one person in the region that had the skills or was in the position to do the validation. So what the Forest Service had done in response to that just said, okay, we'll go with this. We'll put this under a 20-year special use permit to protect your residents with the understanding that it will not be done. So when I got there to be ranger, I had, 7 different houses to
So it's an
dispose,
occupancy issue.
but the history in the files of all the agreements, when somebody'd sell one of those properties, there was something in there that says, we will terminate this permit in 4 years. That's all that's left. And it worked.
Occupancy trespass was a separate and big issue. A lot of people abuse the mining law to get illegal residency on it, but I'd like to go back again historically. I told you I'm very interested in history, so I've read a lot about it, but I mentioned Gifford Pinchot, our first chief, lost his job because of a minerals issue. But in addition, the Forest Service put out a series of use books, which is our first attempt at writing a manual. And Forest Service manuals are an interpretation of the regulation, and they can have force and effect of regulation. If it's in the manual, that's direction to follow. The very first rule I think it was the 1907 use book, dealt with minerals. And it said some of the things that we later said 70 some years later about the Forest Service's ability to deal with certain things. Interestingly, that rule disappeared. That was in later use books, it was no longer there. So again, I think there was a wandering interest on the part of the Forest Service to diligently regulate mining.
Sounds like it. So, how would you like to wrap things up, folks?
Sounds good.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
With lunch?
So the legacy of the of this project is, that this is part of a sort of changing Forest Service. I mean, does this reflect something? Why do you think we're here talking about it? What's the lasting lesson for you, if anybody took one from it?
Well, the lesson I took from it, I was very naive before this project. I assumed keep your head down, do the science, follow the rules, and you'll be successful. And I learned that isn't the case. I mean, humans being what they are and political, there are a lot of other things that come into play, and sometimes the right result doesn't come out the way that you think it should. It gets abused or misguided. And you got to be careful along the way or you might get hurt.
I think these efforts are really valuable because I think the public needs to become aware of what's taking place inside this organization and the history of that.
Probably as well as some of the employees now that aren't near as familiar with some of that stuff. They need to see what some folks in the agency have been able to do in a really tough time. I think that's